plants closed up all over the country. You know, we've lost 90,000 plants since NAFTA, if you think of that, and about 6 million jobs.
President Donald Trump. Trump's tariffs. Automaker Stellantis is temporarily halting production.
Have you ever seen an empire collapse in a single night? Because that's exactly what just happened to America's manufacturing heartland. It didn't take a war. It didn't take a vote. All it took was 10 words typed in the dead of night on Truth Social. If you don't make it here, don't sell it here. With that one sentence, President Trump dropped a 200% import tariff, obliterating the decades-old structure of North American automotive manufacturing. And by sunrise, the fallout had already begun. Stellantis, the parent company of Jeep, Dodge, and Ram, didn't wait for a debate. They shut down factories, evacuated executives to Paris, and began hauling US factory equipment across the border to Canada. Yes, you heard that right. American industrial infrastructure was physically driven out of the country. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. Within days, jobs vanished, prices skyrocketed, dealerships turned into ghost towns, and farmers in Iowa were losing millions due to retaliatory trade barriers. Meanwhile, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union formed their own pact, deliberately excluding the United States. This isn't just about cars. This is about the unraveling of America's economic influence. So buckle up, because in the next few minutes, we're unpacking the entire collapse of US manufacturing, how it happened, who really benefited, and why the biggest threat to American industry might not be a foreign competitor, but a decision made in the middle of the night. It wasn't a televised speech. It wasn't a signed executive order. It wasn't even a coordinated policy rollout. It was just 10 words. 10 words typed at midnight on Truth Social that sent a shockwave through America's industrial core. If you don't make it here, don't sell it here. By morning, the implications were clear. A 200% import tariff targeting foreign manufactured vehicles, especially those assembled in Canada and Mexico, but intended for American consumers. That single post, lacking any formal clarification, triggered a cascade of panic in boardrooms, factories, and communities across the country. And no company felt the quake harder than Stellantis. Stellantis, one of the world's largest automakers and parent to brands like Jeep, Dodge, and Ram, immediately halted production in multiple American facilities. Emergency meetings were convened at their Auburn Hills, Michigan headquarters. Within hours, private jets lifted top executives to Paris. In public, the company was silent. Internally, however, they were preparing for a full-scale retreat. Internal memos began to leak, revealing that Stellantis had frozen all US hiring, paused plant investments, and instructed engineers to prepare transition documents. Translation: the company was not just halting, it was relocating. Entire production lines, from Ram trucks to Jeep Grand Cherokees, were being considered for moves to facilities outside the United States. The numbers were brutal. Automakers typically operate on tight margins, around 6% to 8% in good years. A 200% tariff rendered their North American sales model instantly unsustainable. Vehicles produced in Mexico or Canada and shipped to the US would now incur losses instead of profits. For Stellantis, the choice was clear: fight a losing battle on American soil or pivot fast and survive. But the consequences extended far beyond one company. Within days, ripple effects began surfacing. Local governments were blindsided. Mayors gave tearful press conferences. Union reps scrambled for answers. School districts braced for budget shortfalls as property taxes from manufacturing facilities evaporated overnight. Auto glass installers, tool shops, diners, and gas stations, businesses deeply intertwined with factory life, began laying off staff. In a matter of 48 hours, America's manufacturing backbone felt the tremors of collapse. But while the US was descending into uncertainty, its neighbours were already moving to capitalise. While US policymakers hailed economic nationalism as a victory, Canada saw something very different: a golden opportunity. Within 48 hours of Trump's tariff announcement, newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a bold response strategy. Backed by deep economic experience as former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney wasted no time. In a live address from Ottawa, he declared, "These tariffs represent an economic act of self-harm. Canada stands ready to welcome displaced manufacturing operations with open arms and taxpayer support. And he meant it. A full-scale manufacturing fast-track initiative was launched. Federal subsidies, tax incentives, and accelerated permitting processes were handed out like welcome packages. Windsor and Brampton, Manton, cities that had once been shadows of their former industrial selves, were suddenly buzzing again. Meanwhile, across the border in Michigan and Ohio, scenes looked apocalyptic. At the Detroit Jeep plant, workers arrived to padlocked gates and signs directing them to disconnected hotlines. Dodge's Belvidere plant shut its doors. 12,000 layoffs were confirmed within the first week. But the secondary effect was worse. Economists estimated more than 84,000 livelihoods were at risk due to supply chain interdependencies. Then came a symbolic blow. Flatbed trucks with Canadian license plates began arriving at shuttered American factories. They weren't delivering, they were evacuating. Factory machinery, robotic welding arms, custom jigs, precision die presses was unbolted, loaded onto trailers, and transported north. Videos began circulating online of former Stellantis workers standing in silence as the heart of their industry, literally, rolled out of town. One image, in particular, went viral. A tearful employee standing on the curb, watching his former workstation drive away under a Canadian flag. That image became the unofficial symbol of what the media began calling Detroit's new surrender. And yet, for Canada, it was a masterstroke. By week 2, Carney's administration had approved over $2 billion in subsidies for rehomed auto production. Ontario and Quebec slashed permit wait times from 18 months to just 8 weeks. Regional offices for Stellantis opened within days, welcoming executives who had fled the chaos in the States. Across the border, Americans saw their factories emptied. But north of the Great Lakes, those same production lines were coming back to life, just under different flags. While factories shuttered and equipment fled north, the front lines of the collapse hit the average American in a place they didn't expect, their local dealership. Across the country, Stellantis showrooms transformed from bustling sales centres into ghostly, glass-walled tombs of policy failure. Inventory stacked high, sales staff idle. Trucks that once retailed for $45,000 now sat at $60,000, not because demand increased, but because tariffs inflated import costs. Buyers didn't just hesitate, they vanished. More than 500 dealerships reported 0 sales days within the first month, a figure previously unimaginable in the auto industry. Floor traffic dropped by over 80%, warranty claims went unanswered, technicians were laid off, calls to corporate bounced to voicemails, emails returned errors. Worse, the economic wait extended to car owners. Approximately 800,000 Americans currently own Stellantis vehicles bought through financing plans, vehicles whose values plummeted due to uncertainty and vanishing warranty support. Unable to service them or sell them, many of these cars became financial traps. Loan defaults surged. People walked away from vehicles they could neither maintain nor trade. Franchise owners, many of whom had poured decades into building family businesses, found themselves abandoned. More than 300 filed lawsuits against Stellantis for breach of contract and financial abandonment. Some called it betrayal. Others called it systemic collapse. The parallel to the 1980s automotive busts was stark. But this time, there was no gradual decline. It happened almost overnight. Behind the scenes, balance sheets hemorrhaged red ink. The average dealership employed 42 people and generated over $2.5 million in local payrolls. With sales frozen, those communities were now economic dead zones. This wasn't just a market hiccup, it was a consumer confidence implosion, one triggered not by inflation or recession, but by chaos. As the United States reeled from the collapse, the rest of the world accelerated away. In Paris, Stellantis executives finally broke their silence in a global press conference. But it wasn't broadcast from New York or Detroit. It was streamed to European investors, and the message was clear. The United States is no longer viable for predictable investment. These tariffs make stable production impossible. In that single press event, the company announced a redirection of $6 billion in manufacturing funds, not 1 cent of which would go to American soil. Instead, Brazil would receive $2 billion. Poland, Morocco, and India would split the rest. And Stellantis wasn't alone. Volkswagen paused its $1.3 billion Tennessee expansion. BMW and Mercedes-Benz halted EV plans in South Carolina and Alabama. European automakers began aligning with new trade incentives, offered by the European Commission to help companies exit politically unstable markets. Meanwhile, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union signed a new trilateral trade agreement, the North American Fair Trade Pact. The one glaring omission? The United States. Canadian lawmakers wasted no time. Parliament passed mirror tariffs on American-made diesel engines, farm equipment, and auto parts. Ports refused to process US grain shipments without extensive paperwork. Iowa corn farmers alone reported losses of $400 million in just 1 month. Canada's response, as PM Carney explained, wasn't revenge, it was defense. Friendship requires mutuality, he said. When policies threaten our sovereignty, we must respond. And so, within 3 weeks of Trump's tariff post, the US found itself isolated. The same trade networks it had built since World War II, now reconfigured around it, not through it. Back in Washington, the fallout wasn't just economic, it was political. The White House's inner circle fractured. Treasury officials presented grim economic data. The National Security Council warned of trade instability. Political advisors saw polling collapse in swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Then came the leak, a confidential internal memo titled, "Make Detroit Kneel." It outlined pressure tactics against automakers, contract delays, regulatory probes, and permit freezes. Once the New York Times published it, the internet erupted. Public trust crumbled. Fox News ran segments asking whether tariffs had gone too far. The Wall Street Journal labelled the strategy economic self-sabotage. Conservative commentators, once champions of protectionism, now reversed course. Then, something extraordinary happened. Republicans rebelled. A Gallup Pew poll showed 64% of GOP voters now opposed the tariffs. Senator Karen Weiland, once a rising star in the Republican Party, introduced the Economic Realignment Act, legislation that would revoke the president's power to unilaterally impose tariffs. In her live televised speech, she declared, "If one man's ego can destroy our economy, we no longer have a republic, we have a monarchy." The bill garnered over 100 bipartisan co-sponsors within 72 hours. Labour unions aligned with manufacturing associations. Local officials abandoned party lines. Church leaders called it a moral crisis. In the background, the human cost soared. Stellantis stock dropped 22% post-tariff. Retirement accounts sank. Pension funds cratered. Goldman Sachs forecasted a $100 billion GDP hit if contraction continued. The US now stood at a crossroads. Could it rebuild manufacturing through smart policy, technological adaptation, and restored trust? Or would it slip deeper into isolation, losing the very foundation of its economic might? Because at the centre of this collapse, behind the factories, flags, and finances, remained one unshakable truth. You can't build a future by dismantling your past. In just a few short weeks, an entire era came crashing down. What began as a midnight post spiraled into an international economic crisis. Factories shut, equipment fled, dealerships collapsed, consumers were left holding the bag, and in Washington, chaos reigned as even allies turned their backs. Canada built a new trade alliance. Mexico filed WTO complaints. Europe recalibrated its global production strategy. And through it all, the United States stood increasingly isolated, once the architect of global manufacturing, now locked out of its own creation. But this wasn't just a political miscalculation. It was a strategic betrayal of the American worker. The very people who had powered this nation's auto industry for generations were left with nothing but pink slips, loan defaults, and broken promises. Yet amid the wreckage, some clarity emerged. Tesla's resilience showed that domestic production isn't impossible. It just requires foresight. Other nations like Germany and South Korea have adapted through policy, workforce development, and innovation. So why not America? Because at the core of this disaster wasn't just policy, it was ego. The belief that a nation can strong-arm its way through complex global trade systems without consequences. Now, the question remains, is this the final nail in the coffin of American manufacturing? Or can the US learn from this and rebuild smarter, stronger, and more united? We'll leave that answer to you. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.